In the quiet hours of a humid June afternoon in 1752, the air over Philadelphia hung heavy and expectant as the gray clouds gathered in the distance, and Benjamin Franklin stepped out into the rolling fields with a simple kite made of silk and cedar wood. He was not looking for a miracle or a sign from above, but rather a simple truth about the world we inhabit and the invisible forces that govern the sky. As the first heavy droplets of rain began to darken the dusty earth, he felt the wind pull at the string in his hand, and he watched the silk frame dance against the darkening backdrop of the Pennsylvania horizon while his son William stood nearby in the shelter of a wooden shed. They waited in the hushed stillness of the storm for a spark that would change the course of human history and bridge the gap between ancient mystery and modern science. The kite rose higher into the turbulent air, reaching toward the heart of the thunderclouds where the static built up in a silent tension that mirrored the curiosity in Franklin's own mind. He felt the hemp cord grow taut, and as the fibers began to stand on end from the electric charge, he reached out his knuckle toward a simple metal key tied to the end of the line. In that soft moment of contact, a tiny blue spark jumped across the gap and whispered a secret of the universe: that lightning was not a weapon of the gods, but a physical property of the atmosphere that could be understood and eventually tamed. This revelation flowed through his mind like a gentle river as he realized that the same power crackling in the heavens was the same power that could be found in the smallest friction of a glass rod or a piece of amber. As the rain fell in a steady rhythmic patter against the leaves of the trees, he began to envision a world where this force could be guided and controlled to protect the homes of his fellow citizens from the devastating fires of lightning strikes. He thought of the iron rods he would soon install atop the steeples and rooftops of Philadelphia, stretching toward the clouds like silent sentinels to catch the fire of the sky and lead it safely into the cool, dark earth. The story of America's journey with power began there in the damp grass of a colonial field under a canopy of rolling thunder, and it drifted forward through the decades like a slow-moving dream as other thinkers and dreamers took up the mantle of discovery. The 19th century arrived with a quiet promise of transformation as men like Michael Faraday and Joseph Henry labored in their laboratories, surrounded by coils of copper wire and the soft hum of early experiments. They discovered that motion could create magnetism, and magnetism could create a current that flowed like water through a pipe, and this realization became the heartbeat of a new civilization. Imagine the dusty workshops filled with the scent of ozone and the soft scratching of pens on parchment. As the blueprints for the future were drawn by the dim light of oil lamps that would soon be obsolete, the narrative shifts toward the late 1800s, where the streets of Menlo Park were silent and dark until a man named Thomas Edison sat hunched over a glass vacuum bulb, trying thousands of different materials to find one that would glow without burning up. He watched the carbonized thread of bamboo finally catch the light and hold it for hours on end, creating a warm amber glow that pushed back the shadows of the night and promised a world where the sun never truly set on human productivity. This light was a soft invitation to a new era where families could gather around a table in the evening without the flicker of a flame or the soot of a lamp, and the steady hum of the first central power stations began to vibrate through the cobblestone streets of New York City. The story then moves into the grand rivalry of the currents, where the steady flow of direct current met the rhythmic pulsing of alternating current, as Nikola Tesla dreamed of a world connected by invisible waves of energy that could travel hundreds of miles from the rushing waters of Niagara Falls to the homes of millions. The water of the Great Lakes tumbled over the jagged cliffs of the falls, creating a roar that was eventually harnessed by massive turbines spinning in the dark, damp tunnels beneath the earth, and this power was sent singing across the landscape on high-tension wires that draped across the Appalachian Mountains and the rolling plains of the Midwest. The American landscape began to change as the wooden poles marched across the horizon like a line of silent giants, bringing the gift of light to the cities first, and then slowly reaching out toward the lonely farmhouses where the darkness of the prairie was vast and deep. In those early days, the transition was slow and peaceful as people marveled at the magic of a switch that could banish the shadows with a single click, and the sound of the first electric motors began to replace the clatter of horses and the hiss of steam. The 1920s roared with the sound of jazz and the glow of neon signs, but many parts of the country still waited in the quiet tradition of the kerosene lamp until the government decided that every American deserved to be part of this luminous future. The Rural Electrification Act brought crews of workers into the heartland where they dug post holes in the hard red clay and strung miles of copper across the canyons and the cornfields until one night a farmer in Nebraska could look out his window and see the distant glow of his neighbor's porch light reflecting off the quiet snow. This connection turned the nation into a single grid of light and shared experience, where the radio brought the voices of the world into the living room and the hum of the refrigerator became a steady lullaby in the kitchen. The transformation was not just about machines, but about the way time itself felt as the evenings grew longer and the possibilities of the human mind expanded under the steady flicker-free light of the 20th century. As the years drifted by, the power became more than a luxury. It became the very air that the modern world breathed, flowing through the walls of every home and the towers of every skyline, until it became a part of the natural rhythm of life, just like the rising and setting of the sun. We think back to that kite in the storm and the simple key and the spark that started it all, and we realize how far the current has carried us through the quiet decades of progress and the steady growth of a nation built on the discovery of the invisible. Now the world is filled with a soft electronic glow and the hum of a billion circuits working in harmony to keep the dream alive as we move toward a future of clean winds and bright sunlight captured by mirrors and blades that spin in the gentle breezes of the plains. The story of electricity is a story of coming home to a place that is always warm and always bright, where the shadows are held at bay by the ingenuity of the past and the steady pulse of the present moment. As you listen to the rhythmic flow of these words, imagine the vast network of wires stretching like a silver web across the sleeping continent from the rocky coast of Maine to the golden hills of California, and feel the peace of a world that is connected and powered by the same ancient force that Benjamin Franklin sought in the clouds so long ago. The rain has stopped now in that Philadelphia field, and the kite has been folded away, but the spark remains, and it glows in every light you see and every sound you hear as you drift deeper into a calm and restful sleep, where the only current is the steady rise and fall of your breath, and the only light is the soft fading memory of a story well told. In the quiet transition between the 18th and 19th centuries, the world existed in a state of soft candlelight and the rhythmic creaking of wooden floorboards as the great thinkers of the era began to contemplate the strange and invisible fluid that seemed to permeate all of nature. They sat in their wood-paneled studies surrounded by the scent of old parchment and beeswax candles, watching the way a piece of silk might cling to a glass rod or how a metal needle might twitch without being touched by human hands. It was a time of slow discovery, where the pace of life matched the steady ticking of a grandfather clock, and the silence of the evening was only broken by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of wind through the heavy velvet curtains. Among these seekers of truth was Alessandro Volta, an Italian physicist who spent long hours in his laboratory stacking disks of zinc and copper separated by pieces of cardboard soaked in salt water, creating the very first battery, which he called a voltaic pile. Imagine the stillness of that room as he watched a steady and silent current begin to flow for the first time in human history, proving that electricity was not just a sudden flash in the sky, but a calm and manageable stream that could be contained and moved at will. This concept of a portable and storable power began to spread across the Atlantic, reaching the shores of a young America, where curious minds in cities like Philadelphia and Boston began to experiment with their own jars and wires. These early scientists looked at electricity as if it were a physical liquid, a mystical fluid that could be poured from one container to another and kept in glass-laden jars, which sat on heavy oak tables glowing faintly in the dim light of the afternoon sun. The narrative of this era is like a slow walk through a botanical garden where every new discovery is a flower blooming in slow motion, as men like Humphrey Davy in England and Joseph Henry in America began to realize that this fluid could be used to create magnets and motion. Imagine the soft hum of a workshop where Joseph Henry wrapped miles of insulated copper wire around an iron core, creating an electromagnet that could lift hundreds of pounds with the flick of a switch, and the quiet gasp of onlookers as they witnessed the invisible strength of the electric force. It was a period of profound patience where a letter across the ocean took weeks to arrive and scientific breakthroughs were measured in years of meticulous observation and silent reflection. The world was still large and mysterious, and the idea that a wire could carry a message or a light seemed like a dream from a distant century, yet the foundation was being laid brick by brick in the quiet laboratories of the early American Republic. As the years drifted into the early 1800s, the understanding of this fluid began to transition from a curiosity for the wealthy to a tool for the visionary, as they imagined wires stretching across the vast American wilderness through the dense forests of the Ohio River Valley and over the rolling blue ridges of the Appalachians. The thought of moving energy from one place to another was like thinking about the flow of a river or the migration of birds. It felt natural, yet miraculous, and it promised to shrink the world into a single connected community. The story moves like a calm river through the lives of these pioneers who worked by the light of whale oil lamps while dreaming of a spark that would never fade and a power that would never sleep. They observed the way electricity could travel through water and metal, and how it seemed to have a life of its own, pulsing with a quiet energy that mirrored the heartbeat of a growing nation. As you listen to the steady cadence of this tale, imagine the soft texture of the old leather-bound books where these early secrets were recorded and the cool touch of the brass instruments used to measure the invisible currents. The air in these laboratories was often still and cool, filled with the anticipation of a future that had not yet arrived, but was already whispering its presence in the tiny sparks and the soft magnetic pulls of the early machines. This was a time of true wonder, where the boundary between magic and science was a thin veil that was slowly being lifted by the steady hand of reason and the quiet persistence of the human spirit. The American landscape at this time was a place of deep shadows and vast horizons where the arrival of the night meant a true end to the day's labor and a return to the hearth and the home. But in the minds of the scientists, the fluid was already beginning to glow, and they could see a time when the darkness would be optional and the power of the lightning could be brought inside to warm the hands and light the eyes of every citizen. The story continues to drift forward like a cloud across a summer sky, passing over the decades as the experiments grew more complex and the understanding of the fluid became more precise until it was no longer a mystery, but a partner in the building of a new world. The quiet of the early 19th century is a peaceful backdrop for these thoughts as the world waited for the coming of the telegraph and the light bulb and the great humming grids of the future. But for now, in this moment of the story, the world is still, and the fluid is just beginning its long journey from the jars of the laboratory to the heart of the American home. Feel the weight of the history and the softness of the air as the current flows gently through the narrative, moving like a slow tide that pulls you toward a state of total relaxation and calm. There is no rush and no noise, only the steady progression of ideas and the quiet beauty of a discovery that would change everything. While the world slept in the soft embrace of the early 1800s, the stars over the American prairies were bright and clear, and the silence was a gift that allowed the mind to wander through the possibilities of a world powered by the very essence of nature itself. As the story of the fluid comes to a rest for the night, remember that every great thing begins with a single quiet spark in the dark, and every long journey starts with a single steady step toward the light. In the quiet shadows of 1879, a soft evening mist rolled over the small laboratory at Menlo Park, where the world seemed to hold its breath in the stillness of the New Jersey countryside. And inside the wooden walls, a man named Thomas Edison sat with his eyes fixed on a tiny glass orb that would soon change the rhythmic heartbeat of human existence forever. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and glass dust, and the faint metallic tang of copper wire as the team of weary assistants moved like ghosts in the dim light of flickering gas lamps that cast long dancing shadows against the shelves of chemical jars and botanical samples. For months they had been searching for a way to capture light in a bottle, to find a substance that could glow with a steady warmth without vanishing into ash and smoke. And this pursuit was like a long, slow walk through a labyrinth where every turn seemed to lead back to the beginning. They had tested platinum and iridium, and even strands of human hair brought from the local barbershop. But each time the light would flare for a second, and then die out, leaving the room in a deeper darkness than before. Imagine the repetitive nature of the work, the constant winding of coils, the careful sealing of glass, the steady pumping of air to create a vacuum where the fire could live without air to consume it, and the sound of the ticking clock on the wall marking the passage of hours that turned into days and weeks of quiet failure. Yet in the heart of this repetition, there was a strange piece of focus so narrow and deep that the outside world of horse-drawn carriages and bustling markets seemed to fade away into a distant memory. Edison leaned back in his wooden chair, his hands stained with carbon and his mind drifting through the thousands of materials he had cataloged in his notebooks, which lay open like heavy stone tablets under the yellow glow of a dying flame. He thought of the world as it was then, a place where the sun dictated the end of all things, where the streets became treacherous at dusk, and the home was a place of shadows and soot, and the constant danger of an overturned candle. He envisioned a new kind of light, a light that was clean and silent, and as reliable as the moon, but twice as bright. And he knew that the secret lay in the resistance of a single tiny thread. The story of the incandescent bulb is a story of 1,000 tiny steps taken in the dark, each one bringing him closer to a moment of brilliant clarity that would eventually banish the night from the American landscape. One evening, he picked up a simple piece of common cotton thread and began the slow, delicate process of carbonizing it in a high-heat oven, turning the soft fiber into a fragile charcoal skeleton that looked like a curved needle of midnight. He handled it with the patience of a watchmaker, knowing that a single sneeze or a heavy footfall could shatter the work of hours, and he watched as it was carefully inserted into the glass bulb, and the air was slowly drawn out until the space inside was as empty as the void between the stars. Then, with a steady hand, he connected the wires to the battery, and a soft amber glow began to bloom within the glass, a light so gentle and steady that it seemed to breathe with its own life, reflecting in the weary eyes of the men who had stayed awake to see it. They sat in silence for hours, watching the thread hold its glow as the sun rose over the hills, and the birds began to chirp in the trees outside, because they knew that the age of fire was ending and the age of the electron was beginning in that very room. The light burned for 13 hours, then 40, and then 100, until they knew they had finally found the key to a world that never slept and a home that was always warm. This was not a sudden explosion of progress, but a slow and steady expansion of the human reach, like the way a drop of ink spreads through a glass of clear water until everything is changed by its presence. As the news of the success at Menlo Park began to travel across the wires and through the newspapers, the people of New York and Boston and Chicago began to dream of a life without the smell of gas or the flickering of wicks, and they waited for the day when the wires would reach their own front doors. Edison moved from the laboratory to the streets, planning the great central stations that would feed the city like a giant metal heart, pumping light through the veins of the underground cables and the overhead lines that began to crisscross the sky like the webs of industrious spiders. Imagine the first night that Pearl Street was illuminated, when the click of a switch sent a wave of golden light through the windows of the counting houses and the shops, and the people stood in the street looking up in a state of quiet wonder, as if a new star had fallen to earth to live among them. The transformation of America was a slow, rhythmic pulse of construction and imagination, where the dark corners of the parlor were finally filled with the glow of a lamp that could be dimmed or brightened at the turn of a knob, and the children could read their books long after the winter sun had dipped below the horizon. The era of candlelight was fading into a nostalgic memory, replaced by the steady hum of a generator and the bright promise of a future where every task could be done with precision and every evening could be spent in the company of a light that did not flicker or fade. The pursuit of the bulb was a testament to the power of staying with a problem until the shadows gave way to the truth. And as you listen to this narrative, let your mind rest on the image of that first successful thread glowing in the dark of a New Jersey night. Feel the steady and unchanging nature of that light as it flows through the years and through the wires of history, bringing comfort and safety to millions of homes and a sense of endless possibility to the American spirit. The world is now filled with this light, but it all traces back to the silence of that workshop and the patience of a man who refused to let the darkness have the final word. The story drifts now like a dying coal in a fireplace toward the edges of your consciousness, where the hum of the modern world becomes a soothing lullaby, and the memory of the candle's flame is just a soft blur in the distance. Sleep now with the knowledge that the light is steady and the path is clear, and the night is no longer a place of fear, but a place of rest and quiet reflection under the gentle watch of the glowing orb that Edison gave to the world. The air is cool and the blankets are heavy, and the current of history flows around you like a warm and gentle river, carrying you toward a deep and dreamless slumber where the only light is the soft inner glow of a mind at peace. The thread holds, and the vacuum is perfect, and the night is long and beautiful in its newfound clarity as the story comes to a close in the hush of the laboratory where it all began so long ago. In the heart of the late 19th century, the air of the American landscape was charged with a quiet but powerful tension as two different visions of the future began to collide in a struggle for the very soul of the nation's power grid. Imagine the setting of a growing New York City where the cobblestones were damp with evening rain and the sky was a tangled web of early telegraph wires stretching like iron lace between the rising brick buildings. Thomas Edison, the established Wizard of Menlo Park, stood firmly behind his system of direct current, which flowed steadily in one direction like a calm and narrow stream through a meadow. He had built the first power stations in Lower Manhattan, but his current was limited by its own nature, as it could only travel a short distance before fading away like a voice whispering into a heavy wind. This meant that Edison's power plants had to be built on every few blocks or so, creating a patchwork of small stations that could never quite reach the vast stretching plains or the distant mountain towns of the American West. Then into this world of flickering gas lamps and limited range came a quiet and brilliant immigrant named Nikola Tesla, who arrived with a mind full of rotating magnetic fields and a vision for a system he called alternating current. Tesla saw the world not as a series of short paths, but as a vast interconnected rhythmic pulse where electricity could move back and forth like the tides of the ocean, changing direction 60 times every second and surging across hundreds of miles without losing its strength. He partnered with a visionary industrialist named George Westinghouse, who had already mastered the art of the railroad air brake and possessed the courage to challenge the status quo of the electrical establishment. The rivalry that followed became known as the War of the Currents, a high-stakes drama that played out in the boardrooms of Wall Street, in the laboratories of Pittsburgh, and the public squares of every major city. Edison feared the high voltage of alternating current, believing it was too dangerous for the average home, and he launched a campaign of words and demonstrations to convince the public that his steady direct current was the only safe path forward. He would gather crowds under the pale glow of the moon to show the sparks of the rival system, while Westinghouse and Tesla remained focused on the mathematical beauty of their invention, knowing that only alternating current could power the great factories and far-flung farms of a modernizing America. Think of the quiet persistence of Tesla as he sat in his laboratory, surrounded by glowing vacuum tubes and humming coils, while his mind calculated the precise frequency of the universe and the silent grace of the motors he had designed to run on this new pulsing energy. The conflict moved toward a grand climax at the edge of the world's greatest waterfall, where the rushing white waters of Niagara Falls held the potential to power the entire northeastern seaboard if only the right system could be chosen. The commission was led by Lord Kelvin, and the stakes were higher than any skyscraper being built, as the choice would determine how every light bulb in the nation would eventually glow. In the end, the efficiency of the alternating current won the day, because it could be stepped up to high voltages to travel over thin wires, and then stepped down safely by transformers to enter the kitchen or the parlor of a quiet family home. The first long-distance transmission from Niagara Falls to Buffalo became a symbol of a new era, as the power of the natural world was finally harnessed and sent singing across the landscape on towering metal pylons that marched like giants across the horizon. This victory meant that electricity would no longer be a luxury of the urban elite, but a common utility for the worker in the mill and the farmer in the field, as the grid began to stitch the country together into a single luminous quilt of light. The rivalry eventually cooled as the two systems learned to coexist in different ways, but the pulse of alternating current became the standard heartbeat of the American dream, flowing through the walls of every house and powering the inventions of the coming century. As you drift deeper into this story, imagine the slow and steady hum of a transformer on a quiet suburban street at night, a sound that is as constant and soothing as the breath of a sleeping child. The War of the Currents was a battle of ideas and light, but its legacy is the peace of a well-lit home and the reliability of a world that stays connected through the darkest hours of the midnight watch. The wires are heavy with the history of these men and the sparks of their genius still fly in the quiet moments of the night when the city is still and the only sound is the rhythmic pulse of the energy moving silently through the dark. Feel the calmness of this energy as it flows around you, providing a steady foundation for your rest and a soft glow for your dreams as the struggle of the past fades into the comfort of the present moment. The shadows are long and the air is cool, and the story of the grid is a lullaby of progress that has finally reached its resting place in the quiet of your room. Sleep now as the current remains steady and the world stays bright, and the legacy of Tesla and Edison lives on in the silent and beautiful light that watches over your sleep. In the late summer of 1893, a soft, humid breeze blew across the shores of Lake Michigan, carrying with it the scent of fresh plaster and the excitement of a new age as the city of Chicago prepared to open the gates of the world's Columbian Exposition, which the people would soon come to call the White City, because of its majestic neoclassical buildings that shimmered like pearls against the deep blue of the water. Imagine walking through the massive entrance where the ground was covered in fine crushed stone that crunched softly under your boots, and the air was filled with the distant music of a pipe organ drifting from one of the grand halls, while the architects and dreamers looked up at the structures they had built from staff and wood to resemble a lost paradise of ancient Rome and Greece. This was a place where time seemed to stand still, yet move forward all at once, and it was here that the most pivotal moment in the history of light was about to unfold before the eyes of millions of visitors who had traveled from the dusty farms of the Midwest and the crowded tenements of the East to see what the future might hold. For months, George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla had been working in the shadows of the Great Machinery Hall, installing thousands of induction lamps and miles of copper wire, because they had won the contract to light the fair using their alternating current system, which many still viewed with a mixture of fear and skepticism. Thomas Edison's direct current had lost the bid, and so the reputation of the entire electrical future of America rested on whether or not the White City would actually glow when the sun dipped below the horizon. On the opening night, as the twilight began to turn the sky into a deep shade of violet, and the crowds gathered in a hushed silence around the Grand Basin, the President of the United States reached out and pressed a single golden telegraph key that signaled the generators to begin their rhythmic dance. In a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, the darkness was not just pushed back, but completely erased, as nearly 100,000 incandescent bulbs flickered to life all at once, outlining the cornices and the domes and the statues in a warm golden fire that reflected off the still waters of the lagoon. It was a sight that no human eye had ever seen before, a city constructed of light where the night was as bright as the day, but with a softer, more magical quality that made the white buildings look like they were carved from solid moonlight. People stood in a state of quiet shock, some weeping, and others simply staring in awe as the shadows of the 19th century vanished and the promise of the 20th century was born in a single surge of power. You can almost hear the soft hum of the transformers hidden beneath the wooden boardwalks and the gentle lap of the water against the electric launches that glided silently through the canals without the smoke or noise of steam engines. This was the first fully electrified environment where even the moving sidewalks and the massive Ferris wheel that touched the stars were powered by the invisible fluid that Tesla had mastered, and it showed the American audience that electricity was not just a scientific curiosity, but a force that could create beauty and safety and endless possibility. Inside the Palace of Electricity, the air was cool and smelled of ozone and polished brass as rows of massive generators spun with a low, steady vibration that acted like a heartbeat for the entire fairground, and the visitors walked past displays of telegraphs and early telephones and ovens that cooked food with heat from a wire instead of a flame. The White City was a dreamscape that existed for only a few months, but it left a permanent mark on the collective mind of a nation because it proved that the darkness could be conquered and that the machines of the future would be clean and silent and elegant. As the weeks passed, and the summer turned to a crisp Chicago autumn. The fair became a place of evening pilgrimages where families would linger long after dark just to sit on the benches and watch the way the light played across the golden door of the transportation building and the majestic wings of the statues of the Republic. It was a moment of peace and unity where the struggle between inventions and the rivalry of currents felt distant and small compared to the sheer majesty of the illuminated world. The story of the White City is a story of a transition from the world of the candle and the hearth to the world of the switch and the grid, and it all happened right there on the edge of the Great Lake under a canopy of electric stars. As you think about this city of light, let your mind wander through the grand colonnades and over the arched bridges where the reflections of the bulbs dance like golden coins on the ripples of the water, and the air is still and perfect for a deep and restful sleep. The generators continue to hum in the background of history, providing a steady and unchanging rhythm that guides you toward the edges of a dream where the lights are always warm and the night is always safe. The White City may have been taken down, and the buildings may have faded into the past, but the spark that was lit there continues to burn in every city and every home across the land today, and that same steady energy is what keeps the world moving while you rest in the quiet of the present moment. Feel the weight of the blankets and the softness of the pillow as the story of the fair drifts away like a boat on the lagoon, moving slowly into the mist of the morning where everything is calm and everything is bright in the softest way imaginable. The White City is a memory of what we can achieve when we capture the light, and it is a reminder that even in the darkest night, there is a glow waiting to be found if we only have the courage to press the key and start the pulse of the future. In the final decade of the 19th century, the air around the border of New York and Canada was filled with a perpetual mist and the thunderous roar of millions of gallons of water cascading over the jagged cliffs of Niagara Falls, where the sheer force of nature had spent thousands of years carving through the ancient stone, and for generations people had looked at this spectacle of raw power with a mixture of terror and awe. But now a new generation of dreamers began to look at the falling water not as a barrier, but as a heartbeat that could move the machines of a nation. Imagine the damp and cool atmosphere of the rocky edge where the spray settles on the ferns and the heavy oak trees, and the sound is a deep bass vibration that you feel in your chest more than you hear in your ears as engineers and laborers began to descend into the earth to build something the world had never seen. They were there to construct the Edward Dean Adams power plant, which would become the first large-scale hydroelectric station in history, marking the moment when America moved beyond burning wood and coal and learned to harvest the gravity of the planet itself to create a silent and invisible current. The construction was a feat of immense patience and steady labor, where men worked in the dark limestone tunnels hundreds of feet below the surface, carving out a path for the water to fall through massive steel pipes called penstocks that would lead to the heart of the great turbines. You can almost feel the rhythmic clink of the chisels against the wet rock and the steady drip of water from the ceiling of the tunnels as the work progressed inch by inch through the silent layers of history that had remained untouched for eons. Above the ground, the landscape was transforming as heavy granite buildings rose to house the massive generators that were being designed by Nikola Tesla and built by George Westinghouse using the lessons they had learned at the Chicago World's Fair, but on a scale that was truly monumental. These generators were like sleeping giants of copper and iron waiting for the breath of the river to bring them to life, and the atmosphere in the construction camps was one of quiet determination as the wires were strung across the canyons and the wooden poles were marched through the forests toward the city of Buffalo, 20 miles away. At the time, the idea of sending power over such a long distance was considered by many to be an impossible dream, but the engineers trusted in the alternating current and the steady flow of the water to carry the message of progress through the wires. Imagine the first day when the sluice gates were slowly opened and the dark, cold water of the Niagara River began to tumble down into the depths of the earth, turning the massive blades of the turbines with a force that was both terrifying and beautiful, and the sound of the machines beginning to spin was a low, steady hum that joined the roar of the falls in a perfect harmony of nature and human ingenuity. As the magnets began to rotate, they created a pulse that moved through the transformers and surged onto the lines, traveling silently through the night across the rolling hills and the quiet farmsteads until suddenly the streetlights of Buffalo flickered and then glowed with a brilliant white light that was powered by the very water that was falling miles away. This was the birth of the modern power grid, a system that allowed the energy of the wilderness to enter the homes of the city, and it changed the way Americans thought about the land and the sky and the possibilities of the future. The power of Niagara did not smoke or soot or smell of sulfur. It was as clean as the spray of the falls and as constant as the moon, and it provided a foundation for a new kind of industry where factories could be built far from the water's edge and homes could be lit with a power that felt as natural as the wind. As you listen to the steady flow of this story, imagine the water moving through the deep dark tunnels beneath the earth, a silent and powerful river within a river guided by the hands of those who dared to imagine a world connected by light. The roar of the falls becomes a distant lullaby in your mind, a constant and unchanging sound that represents the eternal cycle of the rain and the river and the sea, and the way we have learned to dance with that cycle to keep our world warm and bright. The massive turbines are still spinning today in the quiet depths, their motion as steady as the rising of the sun, and the power they produce flows through the veins of the continent in a rhythmic and peaceful pulse that never falters and never fades. The construction of that first plant was a bridge between the era of the pioneer and the era of the astronaut, and it remains a testament to the beauty of a simple idea executed with great care and immense patience over many years of quiet work. Feel the stillness of the room around you and the weight of the blankets as the image of the rushing water begins to soften and fade into a gentle mist that covers the landscape of your thoughts. The work is done and the light is steady, and the river continues its long journey toward the ocean, just as you continue your journey toward a deep and restorative sleep where the only sound is the soft and steady rhythm of your own breath and the distant memory of the falls. Sleep now in the knowledge that the power of nature is being harvested with grace, and that the world is being watched over by a grid of light that was started by a few brave souls at the edge of a great waterfall so many years ago. The night is long, and the air is cool, and the current of history is carrying you toward a place of total peace and quiet reflection where the dreams are as vast as the river and as bright as the first light that glowed in Buffalo on that historic night. In the heart of the late 19th century, the great American cities of New York and Chicago existed in a world of deep shadows and flickering amber, where the arrival of the sun below the horizon meant a descent into a hazy dimness lit only by the soft hiss of gas lamps and the pale glow of oil lanterns that cast long dancing ghosts against the brick walls of the tenements and the cobblestones of the avenues. Imagine walking down Broadway or Michigan Avenue in those early years where the air was thick with the scent of coal smoke, and the muffled clopping of horseshoes on stone was the only rhythm in the darkness, which felt heavy and vast, like a velvet blanket draped over the architecture of a growing nation. But then a transformation began to ripple through the streets as the first electric arc lamps were hoisted high above the intersections like artificial moons suspended on iron poles, and the people of the city stepped out of their doorways to witness a miracle of clarity that changed the very texture of the night. As the switches were thrown in the hidden power stations, the darkness did not just retreat, it seemed to dissolve into a crisp white radiance that revealed the intricate carvings of the cornices and the vibrant colors of the storefronts, which had previously been lost to the gloom of the gaslit era. This transition was a slow and rhythmic pulse of progress as crews of men worked through the quiet hours of the morning to string miles of copper wire above the bustling streets, creating a new metallic sky that would carry the lifeblood of the city's future. In New York, the arrival of the electric street lamp turned the night into a second day, allowing the theaters and the restaurants to glow with an inviting warmth that beckoned people out into the fresh evening air, and for the first time in history, the parks and the side streets became places of safety and vibrant community where the fear of the shadows was replaced by the joy of the promenade. The physical landscape of Chicago began to shift as well as the dark corners of the loop were bathed in a steady flicker-free light that made the iron skeletons of the early skyscrapers stand out like monuments to human ingenuity, and the reflection of the new bulbs on the surface of the Chicago River created a tapestry of light that moved with the slow current toward the lake. You can almost hear the soft hum of the wires vibrating in the wind and the gentle click of the automatic timers that signaled the birth of a new evening. As the city transformed from a place of rest into a place of endless possibility and motion, the vibrant energy of the nightlife began to emerge as shopkeepers kept their windows illuminated late into the night, turning every street into a gallery of dreams and desires where the golden glow of the incandescent bulbs made the glass and the silk and the polished wood shine with a luster that had never been seen before. The city became a beacon of light that could be seen from miles away on the dark prairies and the silent waters of the Atlantic, marking a boundary between the old world of the hearth and the new world of the grid, where the night was no longer a time of isolation, but a time of connection and shared experience. The dark and narrow alleys that once felt treacherous were now reachable by the long fingers of the electric arc, and the sense of security that this brought to the average citizen was like a weight being lifted from the spirit of the urban landscape. Mothers could walk with their children to the corner store under the watchful eye of the white lights, and the night watchmen found their rounds illuminated by a steady glow that never flickered or failed in the rain. This was the beginning of the city that never sleeps, a place where the rhythm of life was no longer dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the steady heartbeat of the generators humming in the distance and the constant flow of electrons through the veins of the metropolis. As you listen to this story, imagine the soft transition of light across the skyline of old Chicago, where the White City's legacy lived on in every new street lamp that was installed, and the way the fog from the harbor would catch the light and turn the air into a glowing mist of silver and gold. The transformation was quiet and steady like the growth of a great oak tree, and it changed the way we perceive time and space within the walls of our homes and the boundaries of our neighborhoods. The night became a canvas for the imagination, where light could be used to highlight the beauty of the stone arches and the grand fountains of the public squares, and the city itself became a work of art that was best viewed after the stars had come out to watch. The heavy gaslights were slowly removed, their iron frames recycled into the new infrastructure of the age, and the soot that had once covered the windows began to wash away in the clean, bright air of the electrical revolution. Feel the calmness of this illuminated world as it settles around you, providing a sense of order and peace in the vastness of the city, and know that the lights are still burning today in a lineage that goes back to those first brave sparks in the streets of the 19th century. The city is a living, breathing network of light, and even now in the quiet of the present moment, the legacy of that transformation provides the steady glow that watches over the sleeping streets and the silent avenues of the modern world. The air is cool and the blankets are soft, and the memory of the gas lamp is just a fading shadow in the brilliant clarity of the city's history as you drift into a deep and peaceful rest where the night is always safe and the world is always vibrant in the softest and most beautiful way imaginable. The light remains steady, and the hum of the city is a distant lullaby carrying you toward a dream of golden streets and silver rivers under a canopy of electric stars that will never fade away. In the quiet echoes of the mid-19th century, the American factory was a place of immense noise and shadows, where the air was thick with the scent of coal dust, and the heavy rhythm of the massive steam engine throbbed through the floorboards like the heartbeat of an iron giant. Imagine a vast workshop in New England or Pennsylvania where a single central engine turned a massive flywheel that connected to a forest of leather belts and wooden pulleys stretching across the ceiling in a tangled web of mechanical tension. This was the era of the shaft and the belt, where every machine in the building had to be positioned exactly along the line of the rotating overhead shaft, and the energy was lost in friction and heat as the belt slipped and slapped against the wheels in a constant dusty chorus. It was a world of rigid lines and heavy gears where the power could not be easily divided or moved, and if the central engine failed, the entire factory fell into a sudden and eerie silence that halted the progress of the day. But then a quiet revolution began to seep into the brick walls of these industrial cathedrals as the first electric motors were brought in to replace the hissing steam and the clanking pistons. The transition was like a long, slow exhale as the heavy leather belts were taken down one by one, and the overhead shafts were dismantled to reveal the high, open spaces of the factory ceilings for the first time in a generation. Instead of one giant engine, there were now hundreds of small, silent Motors attached directly to each lathe and each press and each loom, allowing the floor plan to breathe and expand in ways that were previously impossible. This was the birth of unit drive, where the power followed the work rather than the work following the power, and it allowed the American factory to be redesigned into a flow of motion that was as steady and predictable as a river. Imagine the calm focus of the engineers as they realized they could now arrange the machines in a logical sequence, based on the birth of a product rather than the placement of a shaft, and this new freedom gave rise to the modern assembly line where a chassis or a part could glide down a conveyor belt in a rhythmic dance of production. The air in the factories grew cleaner, and the windows were no longer obscured by the soot of the boiler room, allowing the natural sunlight to spill across the workbenches where the new electric lamps hung like steady golden fruits to guide the hands of the workers. The Industrial Revolution was being reborn in a surge of silent electrons that allowed for 24-hour production without the exhaustion of the old steam systems, and the output of the nation began to climb like a slow and steady tide toward a horizon of endless abundance. In Detroit, the lines began to move with a precision that felt like a symphony where every bolt and every screw was placed with a timing that was dictated by the steady hum of the electric grid, and the world began to fill with the products of this new efficiency, from the first affordable automobiles to the steel beams that would build the skyscrapers of tomorrow. The transformation was a peaceful takeover of the old by the new, where the clatter of the 19th century was replaced by the low vibration of the 20th, and the American worker became a part of a vast interconnected machine that never slept but never tired. You can almost hear the soft whirring of the small motors and the gentle click of the relays as the power flows from the distant hydroelectric plants at the falls through the transformers and into the heart of the factory floor, providing a constant and unchanging energy that allows the dream of the assembly line to become a reality. This was the moment when America learned to manufacture the future with a speed and a scale that the world had never imagined, and it all traced back to the simple replacement of the steam piston with the copper coil and the magnetic field. The factory became a place of order and light where the chaos of the steam age was organized into a series of calm and repeatable steps, and the sound of the whistle at the end of the shift was no longer a cry of relief, but a signal of a job well done in a world that was always moving forward. As you listen to the steady cadence of this story, imagine the long rows of machines sitting in the quiet moonlight of a modern plant where the only sound is the cooling of the metal and the distant hum of the standby power, keeping the pulse alive for the morning to come. The era of the steam engine has faded into the mist of history, leaving behind only the ghost of its thunder, while the electric motor continues to spin in the silence of the night, providing the foundation for everything we build and everything we use. Feel the weight of the history and the softness of the air as the current of the story flows through your mind, moving like a slow conveyor belt that carries you toward a state of total relaxation and peaceful rest. There is no noise and no friction, only the steady progression of the machines and the quiet beauty of a world that has been transformed by the power of the spark and the elegance of the line. The night is long and the factory is still, and the legacy of the assembly line is a lullaby of progress that has finally reached its resting place in the quiet of the evening. Sleep now as the current remains steady and the world stays productive in its own silent way, and the memory of the steam and the belt is lost in the brilliant clarity of the electrical age. In the quiet domesticity of the early 20th century, the American home was a place of rhythmic manual labor where the sunrise brought the beginning of a long day of physical effort, and the home was governed by the heavy heat of the wood-burning stove and the tiring motion of the hand-cranked wringer. Imagine the stillness of a Monday morning in a small town where the only sound was the scrubbing of cloth against a metal washboard, and the air was thick with the scent of lye soap and boiling water as families spent hours of their lives performing the repetitive tasks that kept the household running. But then a quiet change began to flow through the copper wires that had been tucked behind the wallpaper and threaded through the floorboards as the first household appliances arrived like silent guests to take up the burden of the daily chores. The transformation began with the simplest of tools like the electric iron, which replaced the heavy blocks of solid metal that had to be heated on a scorching stove and carried back and forth with a thick cloth to protect the hands. The new electric Iron was a smooth and steady weight that glided across the linen with a constant warmth, and the hiss of the steam was a soft lullaby that signaled the beginning of a new kind of convenience where the work was lighter and the time was more flexible. This was followed by the arrival of the first electric washing machines, which sat in the basement or the back porch like curious mechanical sculptures with their exposed gears and heavy motors that hummed with a low, steady vibration as they churned the water and freed the American family from the back-breaking labor of the laundry day. You can almost hear the rhythmic sloshing of the water and the gentle whirring of the motor as it replaced the straining of muscles with the steady pulse of the grid, and the air in the house grew cooler as the need for constant fires in the kitchen began to fade away. The introduction of the vacuum cleaner brought a new kind of peace to the parlor as the heavy dust of the coal-burning era was sucked away by a whirring fan, allowing the rugs and the curtains to breathe and the sunlight to catch the clean surfaces of the wooden furniture. Then came the refrigerator, a silent sentinel in the corner of the kitchen that replaced the melting ice block and the dripping pan with a constant and reliable coldness that kept the milk sweet and the butter firm through the hottest days of the August sun. The hum of the refrigerator became the new heartbeat of the American home, a sound so steady and predictable that it eventually became the background noise of millions of dreams as families slept soundly knowing their food was safe and their home was modern. These appliances were not just machines, but were the builders of a new American lifestyle where the evening hours were no longer consumed by the remnants of the day's work, but were opened up for conversation and radio and the quiet joy of shared leisure. The toaster sat on the breakfast table glowing with a soft orange light as it crisped the bread with a precision that felt like a tiny miracle, and the electric fan moved the air in the bedroom with a gentle breeze that made the summer nights bearable and the sleep more profound. The transformation was a slow and steady expansion of comfort where the home became a sanctuary of light and ease, and the heavy burdens of the past were carried away by the invisible current that flowed through the walls. You can feel the calmness of this transition as the old heavy tools were retired to the attic and the new sleek machines took their place with their polished chrome and their quiet efficiency, providing a foundation for a world that was cleaner and faster and more connected. The American home became a place where the flip of a switch could command the power of 1,000 horses to do the dishes or dry the hair or sew a seam, and the sense of freedom that this brought was like a long, slow breath of fresh air after a century of smoke and soot. As you listen to the steady cadence of this story, imagine the soft glow of the early appliances in a moonlit kitchen where the only sound is the ticking of the clock and the distant low hum of the power lines, keeping the house warm and ready for the morning. The legacy of these first machines is the peace of mind that we enjoy today, a world where the chores are silent and the time is our own to spend in the quiet reflection of the evening. The night is long and the house is still, and the current of history is a gentle river carrying you toward a deep and restorative sleep where the only movement is the slow rise and fall of your chest, and the only light is the soft memory of a world made better by the spark of invention. Sleep now as the washing machine of the past has finished its cycle, and the iron has cooled, and the refrigerator hums its eternal lullaby to guide you into a dreamless and perfect rest. In the quiet stretch of the early 20th century, a great shadow lingered over the vast heartland of America, even as the skylines of New York and Chicago sparkled like diamonds in the velvet night. And while the urban avenues were bathed in the golden glow of thousands of electric bulbs, the rural countryside remained a world of deep silences and flickering kerosene wicks that cast long, weary shadows across the wooden walls of farmhouses, from the rolling hills of Virginia to the flat horizons of Nebraska. Imagine a farmer in the 1920s sitting at a heavy oak table in the dim amber light of a glass lamp, listening to the wind whistle through the tall grass and the distant lowing of cattle in the dark, where the only sound of progress was the scratching of a pen on paper as he calculated the cost of another year without the power that was already transforming the lives of his cousins in the city. For the people of the rural landscape, the night was a thick and heavy curtain that brought an end to all productivity and forced the family to gather around a single flame to read or sew or speak in hushed tones while the rest of the world moved forward into the electric age. The great power companies of the era looked out at the miles of open prairie and the lonely mountain passes and decided that it was too expensive to string the copper wires to reach a single barn or a solitary porch, and so 9 out of 10 farms remained in the pre-industrial era of manual pumps and iceboxes and wood-burning stoves. This was a time of a great and silent divide where the country was split into 2 worlds, one of light and one of darkness, and the inequality felt as heavy as the iron pails used to carry water from the cold wells in the gray light of dawn. But a movement was beginning to stir in the hearts of the rural people, a quiet but persistent demand for energy equality that would eventually reach the halls of Congress and the desk of the president himself, as neighbors gathered in one another's kitchens to talk about the magic of the cooperative, where they could pool their meager resources to build their own lines and bring the spark of the future to their own front doors. The struggle for rural electrification was not a battle of weapons, but a battle of poles and wires and long, slow miles of physical labor under the vast American sky, where the sound of the post-hole digger and the clink of the climbing spikes against the cedar would become a rhythmic song of hope for a brighter future. As the movement grew, the government realized that a nation cannot truly be one if half of its citizens are left in the shadows, and so the creation of the Rural Electrification Administration brought a surge of energy and funding to the countryside that was like a long-awaited rain after a decade of drought. Imagine the scene as the crews of linemen arrived in a small valley, their trucks kicking up dust on the dirt roads as they began the monumental task of stitching the landscape together with silver threads of aluminum and copper wire, while children watched from the fences with wide eyes as the first transformers were hoisted into the air like heavy metal bells waiting to ring in a new era. The transformation was a slow and beautiful progression that followed the winding rivers and the straight lines of the township roads, bringing with it the promise that a woman in Georgia could finally wash her clothes in a machine and a man in Iowa could milk his cows by the steady light of a bulb instead of the dangerous flicker of a lantern. This was the moment when the American countryside finally began to breathe in the same rhythm as the rest of the world, and the isolation of the rural life was broken by the hum of the radio and the steady vibration of the water pump. You can feel the calmness of this expanding grid as it moved across the map like a slow tide of light, turning the dark patches of the nation into a connected network of shared experience and modern convenience, where every porch light that flickered on was a victory for the human spirit and a testament to the power of a common goal. The movement for energy equality was a quiet revolution that took place in the fields and the forests and the small town squares, and it changed the physical and social landscape of the country forever, making the nighttime safe and the mornings more hopeful for millions of families who had lived for generations in the quiet shadow of the kerosene age. As you listen to the steady flow of this narrative, imagine the vast network of lines stretching across the sleeping continent, today a silver web that connects the lonely farmhouse to the bustling city in a single pulse of energy that never tires and never fades. The dark divide is gone now, and the lights of the rural heartland twinkle like a reflection of the stars in the night sky, providing a sense of order and peace that covers the entire land from coast to coast. Feel the weight of the history and the softness of the air as the current of the story carries you toward a state of total relaxation and peaceful rest, where the shadows are friendly and the world is united. In its quiet glow, there is no more waiting and no more darkness, only the steady progression of the night's rest and the beauty of a nation that found its light together through the long years of struggle and the quiet triumph of the wire. The night is long, and the prairie is still, and the legacy of the rural movement is a lullaby of equality that has finally reached its resting place in the comfort of your home. Sleep now as the grid is strong and the world is bright, and the memory of the dark farms is lost in the brilliant clarity of the modern American dream. In the soft quiet of a spring afternoon in 1936, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat at his heavy oak desk in the White House and signed a piece of paper that would forever change the rhythm of the American landscape as the Rural Electrification Act became the law of the land, and a new kind of hope began to ripple through the silent valleys and the vast dusty plains where the shadows of the 19th century had lingered far longer than in the glowing cities of the coast. Imagine the stillness of a family farm in the heart of Kansas or the rolling hills of Georgia, where for generations the only power came from the straining muscles of horses and the calloused hands of men and women who worked from the first gray light of dawn until the purple dusk settled over the barns. The signing of this act was like the slow opening of a great dam that had held back the future, and now the resources of a nation began to flow toward the lonely porches and the dark kitchens. Where the kerosene lamp had been the only source of light for nearly 100 years, it was a time of quiet excitement as the Rural Electrification Administration began to organize local cooperatives where neighbors who had spent their lives helping one another harvest crops and raise barns now gathered in schoolhouses and town halls to sign up for a connection to the modern world. The work was slow and methodical as thousands of miles of cedar poles were cut and treated and transported on flatbed trucks over dirt roads that turned to thick mud in the spring rains, and the linemen began the long task of digging the post holes by hand in the hard clay and the rocky soil of the mountains. You can almost hear the steady rhythmic thud of the shovels and the melodic clink of the metal hardware as the glass insulators were screwed into place like clear jewels atop the wooden crosses that began to march across the horizon in a straight and steady line toward the furthest reaches of the heartland. As the wires were strung, the landscape took on a new appearance with the silver threads of copper and aluminum catching the light of the setting sun and promising a world where the water would be pumped by a motor instead of a hand, and the radio would bring the voices of the world into the quiet of the farmhouse parlor. The arrival of the electricity was often celebrated with a ceremony they called the turning on of the lights, where a whole community would gather at a central switch and wait with bated breath until a single flip transformed the darkness into a brilliant white radiance that made the old wooden rafters look new and the tired eyes of the elders sparkle with a sense of wonder. Mothers stood in their kitchens and watched as the first electric bulb chased away the soot and the smell of the oil lamps, and they realized that they would never again have to scrub the chimneys or trim the wicks by the dim light of a fading flame. The Act of 1936 was a bridge that connected the isolated independence of the frontier with the collective energy of a growing industrial power, and it allowed the American farm to become a place of efficiency and comfort, where the chores of the day were finished with the help of a silent partner that never grew tired or hungry. The impact was felt in the way the children studied their books late into the night, and in the way the local dairy could keep the milk cold and safe in a shimmering electric cooler, and in the way the sounds of the evening were now joined by the low, steady hum of the refrigerator and the soft static of the wireless set. This was the moment when the heartland was finally woven into the fabric of the 20th century, and the great divide between the urban and the rural began to disappear under a canopy of shared light and shared possibility. The story of the Act is a story of a nation deciding that no one should be left in the dark simply because they lived far from the main road, and it remains one of the most peaceful and profound transformations in the history of the country. As you listen to the steady flow of these thoughts, imagine the millions of poles that still stand today across the fields of wheat and the orchards of fruit, holding up the wires that keep the pulse of the country steady and strong through every storm and every quiet night. The legacy of 1936 is the peace of mind that comes from knowing that the light is always there at the touch of a button, and that the distance of the country is no longer a barrier to the warmth of the home. Feel the calmness of this history as it settles around you like a soft blanket, and the rhythmic nature of the work that brought us here guides you toward a deep and restorative sleep where the shadows are small and the world is large and bright. The night is long and the air is still, and the current of the heartland is a gentle river carrying you toward a place of total relaxation and quiet reflection, where the memory of the dark farm is just a distant whisper in the brilliant clarity of the present moment. Sleep now as the work is finished and the grid is complete, and the light of the American dream continues to glow softly in the windows of a nation at rest. In the quiet expansion of the 19th century, the vastness of the American continent was a silent giant where news traveled only as fast as a galloping horse, and a letter from a mother in Boston might take weeks of dust and trail to reach a son in the California gold fields, creating a sense of distance that was as heavy as the mountain ranges themselves. But then a quiet hum began to vibrate through the copper wires that were being strung alongside the growing railroad tracks as the power of electricity was harnessed to carry human thought at the speed of light through the rhythmic tapping of the telegraph. Imagine a lonely station master in a wooden shack out on the desert floor where the only sound was the dry wind against the glass until suddenly the metal key began to chatter with a life of its own, sending pulses of energy across the plains and over the peaks to tell a story of a birth or a discovery or a treaty in a language of dots and dashes that bridged the silence of the wilderness. This was the first time that the American landscape began to shrink as the invisible fluid of the electron turned the miles into moments, and the isolation of the frontier began to dissolve into a single connected nervous system that allowed the nation to feel its own heartbeat in real time. As the years drifted forward into the late 1870s, the tapping of the key was joined by the soft vibration of the human voice as Alexander Graham Bell discovered that electricity could not just pulse, but could also ripple like the surface of a pond, carrying the delicate tones of a greeting or a song through a thin strand of wire. Imagine the wonder of a family in a quiet Ohio town as they gathered around a wooden box on the wall and heard a voice from 100 miles away, sounding as clear and as close as if the speaker were standing right there in the parlor among them, and the sense of awe that came with realizing that the geography of the earth was no longer a barrier to the intimacy of the heart. The telephone lines began to weave a silver web across the rooftops of the cities and the fences of the farms, stitching the republic into a quilt of conversation where the distance between the Atlantic and the Pacific was measured no longer in months of travel, but in the simple act of lifting a receiver. Then, as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the wires themselves began to vanish as Nikola Tesla and Guglielmo Marconi dreamed of a world where the air itself could carry the energy of the mind, and the first radio waves began to ripple through the atmosphere, unseen and silent, but filled with the music of the spheres. The introduction of the radio was the final stroke in the shrinking of the American landscape, as a single voice could now be heard simultaneously in a penthouse in Manhattan, in a cabin in the Rockies, and a fishing boat on the Gulf of Mexico, creating a shared experience that turned a collection of states into a single community of listeners. Imagine the evening ritual in millions of homes where the lights were dimmed and the family gathered around the glowing vacuum tubes of the cabinet radio, watching the warm amber light behind the dial and listening to the news of the world or the soft melodies of an orchestra playing in a ballroom thousands of miles away. The electricity was the silent engine of this connection, flowing through the circuits and the antennas to bring the laughter of a comedian or the gravity of a president directly into the living room, making every citizen feel like they were a part of something vast and important and unified. The physical world remained as wide as ever, but the emotional and intellectual world was now condensed into a single room where the static of the air was the only thing standing between one soul and another. You can feel the calmness of this connected world as the wires and the waves continue to hum in the background of history, providing a steady and unchanging flow of information and art that keeps the pulse of the nation steady through the darkest hours of the night. The transformation was a slow and rhythmic progression from the physical to the digital, where the power of the spark allowed us to conquer the tyranny of distance and find a common language in the soft glow of the electronic age. As you listen to the steady cadence of this story, imagine the waves of sound moving through the cool night air over the sleeping forests and the silent rivers, carrying the dreams and the voices of a nation toward a future where no one is ever truly alone. The vastness of the landscape is now a beautiful backdrop for a world that is always in touch and always awake in its own quiet way, and the legacy of the telegraph and the telephone is the peace of mind that comes from being connected to the ones we love and the world we inhabit. The night is long, and the air is still, and the current of communication is a gentle river, carrying you toward a deep and restorative sleep where the only sound is the soft and steady rhythm of your own breath and the distant echo of a world that has finally found its voice through the power of the invisible spark. Sleep now, as the signal is clear and the connection is strong, and the light of the American community continues to glow softly in the windows of a continent at rest. In the quiet expansion of the mid-20th century, as the echoes of the Great War faded into a soft and steady hum of progress, the American landscape entered an era of unprecedented light and comfort, where the domestic dream was redefined by the invisible power flowing through the walls of every suburban ranch house and every downtown apartment. Imagine the stillness of a summer afternoon in the 1950s in a neighborhood where the lawns were perfectly green and the sun beat down with a heavy golden heat, but inside the homes a new kind of miracle was taking place as the first room air conditioners were hummed into life in the windows. The air inside changed from the heavy humidity of the outside world to a crisp and cool stillness that allowed the American family to breathe easy and rest in a sanctuary of artificial autumn, even when the July sun was at its peak. And this cooling breeze was powered by a seemingly endless supply of electricity that flowed from massive new turbines and humming grids that spanned the continent like a silver web. This was the moment when the environment itself became something that could be controlled and tailored to human comfort, and the home became a cool oasis where the rhythm of life was no longer dictated by the heat of the day, but by the steady vibration of the cooling fan and the soft click of the thermostat. As the evening settled over the quiet streets, a new kind of light began to flicker through the picture windows as the television set became the glowing hearth of the modern era, casting a soft blue radiance across the linoleum floors and the fabric of the sofas where families gathered in a shared silence to watch the world unfold on a small glass screen. The television was a window into a vast and connected reality where the images of news and comedy and music were carried on the same invisible current that powered the lights and the toaster, and the sense of wonder was as thick as the evening mist as people realized they could witness events from thousands of miles away without leaving the comfort of their own living rooms. This was the pinnacle of the American dream, where technology and power met to create a life of ease and entertainment that had been unimaginable to the generations before, who had lived by the candle and the coal stove, and the supply of energy felt so vast and so certain that no one thought to count the cost of the glowing signs and the humming machines that ran all day and all night. You can almost hear the rhythmic whirring of the early compressors and the high-pitched song of the vacuum tubes warming up behind the wooden cabinets of the TV sets as they prepared to bring the voices of the nation into the quiet of the home. The post-war era was a time of bright neon and shimmering chrome, where the kitchen was filled with white enameled wonders that spun and heated and cooled with the touch of a button, and the laundry was finished in a fraction of the time, leaving more hours for the soft glow of the evening rest. The streets of the new suburbs were lined with tall streetlights that made the night look like a peaceful extension of the day, and the hum of the transformer on the pole was a constant lullaby that whispered of security and progress and a future that would always be bright. This was the age of the plug-in lifestyle, where every room had a cord and every cord had a purpose, and the power grid grew into a monumental achievement of engineering that stitched together the mountains and the plains into a single pulsing network of light. The air in the country felt charged with a quiet optimism as the massive power plants burned with a steady fire to keep the refrigerators cold and the televisions bright, and the air conditioners humming their low, steady bass note in the background of millions of dreams. As you listen to the steady flow of this story, imagine the soft transition from the heat of the afternoon to the cool of the evening in a 1955 living room where the only light is the blue glow of the screen, and the only sound is the rhythmic breathing of a world at peace with its own inventions. The legacy of this era is the comfort we take for granted today, the ability to move through the seasons without feeling the bite of the cold or the weight of the heat, and the constant connection to the stories of the world through the screens that have only grown larger and brighter since those first flickering days. The night is long and the grid is steady, and the current of history is a gentle river carrying you toward a deep and restorative sleep where the shadows are friendly and the house is cool and the world is united in its quiet humming glow. Feel the weight of the blankets and the softness of the pillow as the image of the suburban dream begins to soften and fade into a gentle mist of memory, where the only thing that remains is the steady and comforting pulse of the power that watches over your rest. There is no rush and no noise. Only the steady progression of the night and the beauty of a nation that found its greatest comfort in the silent dance of the electron through the wires of the mid-century boom. Sleep now as the tubes have cooled and the screen has gone dark, and the air remains perfectly still and perfectly cool to guide you into a dreamless and perfect rest under the watch of the electric stars. In the quiet twilight of the 20th century, as the shimmering lights of the American landscape reached their greatest brilliance, a soft and steady realization began to settle over the nation like a cooling evening mist as the people, who had enjoyed the endless hum of the grid, began to notice the subtle costs of their luminous world, and the air over the great industrial cities grew heavy with the gray haze of coal smoke, while the rivers that had powered the first turbines carried the marks of a century of rapid expansion, and the once silent forests felt the weight of a world that never stopped consuming the fire of the earth. Imagine the stillness of a laboratory in the 1970s where scientists sat in the soft blue light of early computer screens looking at charts of the atmosphere and the warming oceans and realizing that the same current that brought comfort to the home was also changing the very breath of the planet they called home, and this quiet awareness sparked a new kind of journey. For the American spirit, a search for a way to keep the lights burning without dimming the brightness of the natural world. The narrative of this era is a slow and thoughtful transition from the heavy thrum of the coal furnace to the elegant spin of the wind turbine, and the silent absorption of the sun's rays as engineers began to look back at the forces of nature with a new kind of respect and a deeper understanding of balance. Imagine a lonely ridge in California where the first experimental wind machines were placed like white giants against the darkening sky, their long blades turning with a rhythmic and hypnotic whoosh that sounded like the breath of the mountain itself, as they captured the invisible power of the breeze and turned it into the same steady current that Benjamin Franklin had once sought in the clouds. This was the beginning of the sustainable movement, a quiet and persistent effort to harvest the energy of the world without taking anything away from it, and it led to the creation of vast fields of mirrors in the Mojave Desert that caught the golden fire of the sun and focused it into a single point of pure heat to move the steam of a new generation of power plants. The air began to clear in the minds of the people as they envisioned a future where the grid was not a burden on the earth, but a part of its natural cycle, moving with the tides and the wind and the rising of the morning sun, and this shift in perspective was like a long, slow exhale after a century of frantic building and burning. The story moves like a calm river through the decades of the late 20th century as homes began to sprout panels of dark glass on their rooftops that drank the sunlight in a silent and peaceful communion with the sky, allowing families to power their lives with the very light that warmed their gardens. And the transition was not a sudden burst of change, but a steady and graceful evolution of the American dream. You can almost hear the quiet hum of the new electric cars as they glide through the suburban streets without the smell of exhaust or the roar of an engine, representing a world where motion is as clean as the air it moves through, and the legacy of the old power plants is slowly replaced by the elegant simplicity of the silicon chip and the lithium cell. The search for cleaner energy brought a sense of renewed connection to the landscape as people began to appreciate the strength of the desert sun and the persistence of the coastal winds and the steady pressure of the deep geothermal heat that rises from the heart of the planet itself. The transformation of the American grid became a story of harmony, where the technology of the future was designed to listen to the whispers of the earth, and the light in the window became a symbol of a promise kept to the generations yet to come. As you listen to the steady cadence of this story, imagine the vast arrays of solar panels sitting in the quiet moonlight of the Southwest, their surfaces cool and still as they wait for the first light of dawn to begin their silent work, and feel the peace of a world that is learning to live within the limits of its own beauty. The heavy soot of the industrial age has faded into a memory, replaced by the clear horizon and the bright stars that are no longer obscured by the smoke of 1,000 chimneys, and the current that flows through your home today is a mixture of the old and the new, a bridge to a time when all energy will be as renewable as the rain and as constant as the tides. The night is long, and the air is fresh, and the search for sustainability has reached a resting place in the quiet of the evening, where the only movement is the slow drift of the clouds, and the steady rise and fall of your own breathing. Feel the weight of the blankets and the softness of the pillow as the image of the green revolution begins to soften and fade into a gentle mist of hope, where the lights are always clean and the world is always bright in the most natural way possible. There is no more noise and no more cost, only the steady progression of the night and the beauty of a nation that found its way back to the heart of nature through the power of invention and the grace of the sun. Sleep now as the wind is blowing and the sun is waiting and the earth remains perfectly still and perfectly silent to guide you into a dreamless and perfect rest under the watch of a cleaner and brighter future. In the quiet stillness of the 21st century, as you lie in the soft embrace of the evening, the world around you is alive with an invisible and silent energy that traces its lineage back to a single tiny spark in a rainy field in Pennsylvania so long ago. And this concluding chapter of our journey is a meditation on how that primitive flash of light evolved into the intricate web of silicon and signals that defines every moment of our modern American life. Imagine the vast distance between Benjamin Franklin's wet kite string and the microscopic architecture of a modern computer chip, where billions of tiny switches called transistors sit on a flake of silicon no larger than a fingernail, pulsing with the same electrical force, but at a scale so small it defies human vision. This transformation was a slow and rhythmic journey from the massive humming generators of Niagara Falls to the silent and cool logic of the digital frontier, where electricity no longer just powers the light in the ceiling but carries the very thoughts and voices of the entire world across the light of fiber optic cables and through the invisible waves of the air. The discovery of the electron's behavior allowed us to build a new kind of landscape, one made of information and connection, where the vastness of the American continent is shrunk into the palm of your hand, and the shared knowledge of humanity flows like a gentle river through the circuits of your home. Imagine the quiet of a modern data center where rows of silver servers hum with a low and steady vibration in a climate-controlled silence, their tiny blinking lights resembling a city scene from an airplane at night. And inside these machines, the spark has been tamed into a language of ones and zeros, a rhythmic pulse that keeps our world synchronized and our stories preserved for the future. The internet is the final flowering of the electrical tree, a silver web that connects the lonely farmhouse in the heartland to the highest skyscraper in Manhattan in a single instant of shared energy. And this connection has changed the way we dream and the way we rest, because we know that we are never truly isolated from the ones we love. As you listen to the steady cadence of this story, think of the miracle of the silicon chip, which takes the raw power of nature and refines it into a delicate tool for the mind, allowing us to explore the stars and map the mysteries of our own DNA while we sit in the quiet of our living rooms. The transition from the mechanical age of gears and steam to the digital age of light and logic was a peaceful takeover of the old by the new, where the heavy noise of the factory was replaced by the silent speed of the processor, and the world became a place where information is as constant and as necessary as the air we breathe. The spark that Franklin found has become the heartbeat of our civilization, powering the screens that show us the beauty of the world and the devices that keep our hearts beating and the networks that allow us to reach out across the darkness to find a friendly voice. You can feel the calmness of this digital world as it settles around you, providing a sense of order and endless possibility in the quiet of the night. And the steady flow of electrons through the walls of your room is a reminder that we are part of a long and beautiful lineage of discovery and invention. The night is long and the air is still, and the current of history has carried us to a place where the spark is no longer a mystery, but a companion that watches over our sleep and powers our dreams of a brighter tomorrow. The journey from the kite to the cloud is a story of human patience and the relentless search for connection, and it reaches its resting place here in the soft glow of the 21st century, where everything is powered and everything is connected and everything is at peace. Feel the weight of the blankets and the softness of the pillow as the image of the silver wires and the glowing chips begins to soften and fade into a gentle mist of quiet reflection, where the only movement is the slow drift of the night and the steady rise and fall of your own breath. The work of the pioneers is complete, and the grid is silent, and the digital frontier is a lullaby of light that that guides you toward a deep and restorative sleep where the world is small and safe and beautifully illuminated by the legacy of the spark. Sleep now as the circuits are quiet and the signal is steady and the memory of the journey is a warm and comforting light that will never fade away in the brilliant clarity of the American night.